During World War II, millions of soldiers fought across different fronts, each one believing in the version of reality they had been taught. Among them were the soldiers of Nazi Germany, men who had grown up under an extremely effective propaganda machine. From an early age, they were taught that the United States was weak, a divided nation, a people without discipline, an artificial economy built on illusion. But all of that would begin to collapse the moment these soldiers were captured, and even more so when they set foot on American soil. Because what they found there was not weakness. It was something entirely different. It was power, a level of industrial power so overwhelming that many of them realized in that very moment the war was already lost. At the height of the war, more than 400,000 German soldiers were brought to the United States as prisoners of war. They came from different fronts: North Africa, Italy, France. Some had fought the British, others the Soviets. But very few truly understood who they were fighting against. The journey to the United States was long. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying hundreds of prisoners, men exhausted, wounded, still holding on to what they believed was the truth. To them, it was just a transfer, but in reality, it was the beginning of a profound transformation. As the ships approached the American coastline, the first impression already began to shatter everything they had been taught. Busy ports, cranes operating without pause, ships being loaded and unloaded with astonishing efficiency. Nothing destroyed, nothing in ruins, nothing like Europe, which was already being consumed by war. It was a silent shock, because at that moment, many began to realize reality might be very different, but the real impact was yet to come. As they were transported inland, German prisoners began to see something that simply did not exist in Europe anymore. Perfect roads, cities functioning normally, stores fully stocked, people living their lives as if the war were far away. While in Germany, scarcity had already become part of everyday life. In the United States, there was abundance: food, fuel, clothing, equipment, everything in quantity and in quality. And then they saw the factories, and that's where everything changed. At that time, the United States was known as the arsenal of democracy. And that wasn't just symbolic, it was literal. Massive factories operated 24 hours a day. Production lines stretched for miles. Men and women worked without stopping, producing weapons, vehicles, ammunition, aircraft, on a scale that German soldiers simply could not comprehend. While Germany struggled to maintain production, the United States produced in excess. While German cities were being bombed, American industry expanded. While resources were scarce in Europe, in the United States, they seemed endless. For many prisoners, this was the breaking point. They began to compare how many tanks Germany could produce versus how many the United States produced. How many aircraft, how many trucks, how many ships, and the conclusion was unavoidable. The difference wasn't small, it was overwhelming. And then came a thought, one that few dared to say out loud. How can we possibly win against this? But the impact wasn't only industrial, it was human. Inside the prison camps, German soldiers encountered conditions they never expected. They received regular meals, they had shelter, they had medical care, and in many cases, they worked, but not as slaves. They were sent to farms, helping with harvests, or to small industries, assisting in production, and in return, they received symbolic wages. This was completely outside the narrative they had been taught, because Nazi propaganda had said their enemies were brutal, inhuman, cruel, but reality was more complex. In many situations, prisoners interacted with American civilians. They talked. They worked side by side. And little by little, they began to realize something uncomfortable. Americans were not what they had imagined. And more than that, the life of an average American civilian often seemed better than that of many German soldiers. That contrast was devastating, because it wasn't just about losing a war. It was about realizing everything they believed in might be wrong. Some prisoners began to question. Others resisted. There were still those who remained loyal to the ideology, but doubt had already taken root, and that doubt grew stronger every day. The United States didn't just hold prisoners. They also tried to re-educate them. Cultural programs were introduced. Books, films, classes, different ideas, different perspectives. It was a clear attempt to break the influence of Nazi propaganda, and for many, it worked, because now, they were no longer just hearing speeches. They were seeing reality with their own eyes. And that reality said something very simple. The United States had resources, they had organization, they had capacity, but above all, that they had scale, a scale that turned the war into a matter of time. Meanwhile, in Europe, Germany's situation continued to deteriorate. Constant bombings, growing shortages, pressure on all fronts, and the prisoners knew it. They heard things, they compared, they analyzed, and many reached the same conclusion. Germany could not win. This realization did not happen all at once. It was gradual, silent, but inevitable. And perhaps, this was one of the most important defeats of the war, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the soldiers. Because when a soldier stops believing in victory, the war has already begun to end, and that is exactly what happened. At the end of the war, many of these prisoners returned to Germany, but they were no longer the same. They had seen something few Germans had ever witnessed, a country operating at full capacity, a massive economy, a society that, even in wartime, continued to move forward. They carried that experience with them, and in a way, that experience helped shape the post-war world. Because understanding the industrial power of the United States was understanding why the war ended the way it did. And perhaps, that is the most important lesson of this story. Wars are not won by weapons alone, but by production, logistics, organization, and the ability to sustain effort over years. And in that regard, the United States was on an entirely different level, far beyond anything German soldiers had imagined. And that's why, when they saw it with their own eyes, they fell silent, because in that moment, they understood the war was already decided.